My name is Sue Stokes. I'm a professor in the political science department, and I'm the director of the Chicago Center on Democracy. And this is super exciting. I think Ellen Lust is our first outside speaker of the year, so it's a great way to kick off. She is a professor of political science at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and she is a leading expert in Middle Eastern, North African politics and development. She's taught at Rice University, if I remember correctly, and at Yale. In fact, we were colleagues at Yale. And she is the author of a bunch of books and articles. She's a very productive and impactful scholar. She's had a big impact in many ways in Middle East, the study of Middle Eastern politics, and also in the study of democratic erosion. She's written seminal work in that area. Any of you who have taken the democratic erosion course will have read a really important study by Last and Law. And so you know her from that. She is the founding director of the Governance and Local Development Institute, which started at Yale, and then I think you took it with you when you went to Gothenburg. She's also the co-founder. I didn't even know all this. This is like, kind of makes me tired reading all this stuff. She is the co-founder of the Transitional Governance Project and a founding associate editor of the Middle East Law and Governance, which is a journal. And she served as an advisor and consultant to a bunch of organizations. She's less stuck in the ivory tower than many of us. She has advised the Carter Center, Freedom House, the NDI, UNDF, UNDP, USAID, and the World Bank. And she's going to be talking today. Her remarks are related to a book that she published in 2022, and it is called Everyday Choices, the Role of Competing Authorities and Social Institutions in Politics and Development. This book came out in a series that Cambridge University Press has been sponsoring for a few years, and it's called Elements, and it's a wonderful idea because it's sort of short books. So if these were fiction, they'd be novellas, and they're written for a broad audience. They give you a great sense of the scope of what we know about a subject, but it's not an enormous time investment to get through them. Knowing how Ellen writes, I'm sure it's super engaging. It's also available for free from Cambridge University Press. She says, don't buy it on Amazon. They want to charge you $22 for it, but it's available for free if you go on the Cambridge University Press website. So without further ado, delighted to have you here, Ellen, and please take it away.
Thank you. And thank you for coming, and thank you for hosting. I appreciate it very, very much. First, before I start, I'm not going to, because of saving time for your comments and questions, I'm not going to go through all this in great detail. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. These are things that are available through the Governance and Local Development Institute, and you can find it on the website. So I encourage you to either get involved through the opportunities we have or use the resources we have, or both. And feel free to ask me questions afterwards if you have any. But I wanted to really sort of spend the time that we have mostly discussing Everyday Choices, which is a framework that I'm hoping will be useful to people in terms of trying to think through how we understand politics and how we think about development questions, as both in terms of the study and in terms of programming. It's the basis of my own work, sort of moving forward, and so for that reason, while I'm presenting something that is finished in one hand, it's something I very much want to hear critical comments about. I want to hear, extensions and ideas, where you would take it. This is very, very useful for me. And again, I'm hoping also, and I'll sort of explain a little bit at the end, some of the projects that we're engaged in moving forward, so that if you're working on similar things, I would love to hear it and to know. So let me step back for a second and just take a look at what we're seeing here, which is a picture of sort of voters lined up in the Cairo 2020 elections. And if you think about them from the sort of, maybe the sort of standard, at least U.S. civics textbook that you might have had in 10th, 11th grade or so, you should be thinking that they're thinking about, which person will sort of, be most capable of delivering and will deliver for them and for Egypt the things that they feel like, the policies that are aligned with their interests, right? I mean, that's a nice sort of textbook understanding about what voters should think about when they go to the polls. And if you talk to people, you'd also find that they're thinking about who knows whom, right? This person knows this person, and they know the candidate, whether the candidate is from a family that they're from, or in some cases, not necessarily in Egypt, from a tribe that they're from, whether or not they have been bussed in to vote by their boss, and who their boss made very clear was the right person to vote for, who the imam was talking about the last time they went to mosque. So there's a lot of other things that are going on in people's minds, and that are not necessarily sort of the question about effectiveness and policy. And you might say, okay, well, that's fine. This is Egypt, right? It's authoritarian. Who thinks that people are going to really be sort of expecting that the MPs they vote for are going to do a lot anyway? So, maybe this is sort of useful in these cases, but not necessarily here. And I want to actually argue that this is not just a Global South issue, even though I'm going to talk a lot about Global South cases, but that we also see things, for example, in the U.S., right? And so we know, there are times when congregations very clearly suggest how you should vote, what kinds of policies are in alignment with being a good Christian, right? And that you might think to yourself, okay, well, it's not necessarily about my take on this issue, but I'm a good Christian, and I want to be a good Christian within my congregation. We know this from road sign or lawn signs that some people in some neighborhoods, even though they might support a candidate that their neighbors didn't support, would be concerned about putting it out there, either because it would be basically sort of removed or defamed, or because they would worry that others in their neighborhood would see them as not a good person, right? So we're all nodding because we sort of know these things, right? And we have some words for them. We talk about corruption, we talk about accountability, clientelism, traditional authorities. We think about politics and religion, or ethnicity and religion. So there's a way in which there's a lot, and maybe even most of our work in some way acknowledges these factors. But what I want to do is try to get us to think about how we might systematically bring this huge amount of literature together in ways that we can more easily understand, how one study speaks to another. Are these really contradictions, or are there systematic understandings about sort of the context in which they're taking place that allow us to understand why we might get different answers in one place or another? Or what's a sort of fundamental problem with regards to sort of policy and programming, why policies and programs, development projects that work in one place don't work, even in the same country in other areas, or that work at one place in one time, as Posner and colleagues have shown us, don't necessarily work 10 years later, even in the same place. So what is that we can maybe bring together as a framework that allows us to understand this? And I want to start by thinking about temperature warning. I want to start by thinking about why we might not, might not already have this framework. And I want to argue that the literature can be thought of as either 3 or 4 literatures, but basically that they're, siloed in some ways and incomplete in others. So I'd say that the vast majority of the literature, particularly for political science, has a state-centric perspective, right? So it takes the state and the state institutions at the center, and then thinks about times when these are disrupted, but sort of the main focus is state institutions, right? So we think about autocracies and democracies, how those might affect things like economic growth. We think about majoritarian or sort of PR, electoral rules, and how that might affect sort of the outcomes that we get. And the rest, sort of the kind of the disruptions are often sort of put in the context of weak states, weak state institutions, again, or things like corruption, right? So that, I think, is the dominant literature that we have. And one thing that I'm going to be suggesting is that we need to set instead the state and multiple non-state institutions on the same level, not dichotomize the state and non-state, and then take the state as primary. So the second set of literature focuses on social institutions, and here Helmke and Levitsky, of course, made a classic statement of saying, we have to pay attention to social institutions. Did so interestingly in a way that started an equation of social institutions and informal institutions. I want us to separate those things. I want to sort of suggest that sometimes institutions that are not state institutions can be codified, and I want to use formal for codification, because I think it's important to think about whether or not having an institution codified is different from having one that is not sort of a parchment or written institution. But the other thing is that it still tended to be state-centric. So we still focused on whether these informal or social institutions were complements or substitutes for the state. So a lot of the literature took that perspective and often didn't do much to think about differences in institutional rules. So more recently we have work, for example, by Rachel Brulé that's thinking about taxation, right? Do people in matrilineal or patrilineal societies, do they think differently about whether or not taxation is good? Generally, in patrilineal societies, women think taxation is good, or they're more willing to pay taxes and men are less willing to. They find that it flips in matrilineal societies. So that starts to think about the sort of the distinction across different types of institutions that are outside of the state. But I think, again, that more can be done in that way. And certainly more can be done to both include thinking about the strength of these institutions as well as the sort of the design of them, right? So, when are these stronger or weaker, and sort of how does that play out? The third set of literature is that on hybridity and intersectionality. It's really two literatures. That's why I said 3 or 4 earlier. And one is thinking about intersectionality is sort of drawing our attention to the fact that things aren't simply additive. So there may be discrimination for women versus men. There may be discrimination for blacks versus whites. But being a black woman and a white woman and a black man and a white man is not simply that black women are doubly disadvantaged, right? That actually you can argue black men in many cases have things worse. So these kinds of issues are at the heart of intersectionality, and drawing our attention to that. Hybridity does something even closer to what I'm going to try to do, and that is to say that people are sort of members of multiple communities, right? I am both a voter, but I'm also a citizen of the state, but I'm also a member of a congregation, and I'm a member of an ethnic group, and all of these things come to play to determine how I think about when I go to the polls, right? And I think that's extremely useful. It almost takes the standpoint of saying, okay, all of these things matter, right? It's almost, if you're thinking about baking, you're starting with the fact that you've got a mix. And I want to say, can we say something about these different sort of components, these different, what I'm going to call arenas of authority, right? And the social institutions within them that will help us to understand what that mix essentially looks like. So that's the goal of what we're trying to do. And again, I think that it will help to overcome a few problems. One, that we often assume or presume rather than interrogate which institutions and which arenas of authority matter. That we overlook then sort of important distinctions, and theoretically, I mean, we hear this a lot more. Well, things are different because context is different, right? But we don't go very far into understanding what about context is different. And so the point of this is to help us, give us some sort of ways to think about how do we understand differences of context that allow us to sort of be more systematic. And then, of course, the hope is that we can understand why something that's a scholarly study in one place looks very different in another, or why we get programs that work in one place and fail in another. And ultimately, to hopefully not only sort of aggregate existing knowledge, but sort of think carefully about studies moving forward in such a way that we can aggregate kind of better in the future. So that's the goal of this. I want to start by saying that the way that I want us to think about this is that most outcomes, and actually all outcomes, are effectively the outcomes of individual choices, right? Whether we're talking about which candidate wins, right, which is aggregated. We can talk about different aggregation rules and how that might differentially translate a set of votes into outcomes. But still, ultimately what's happening is individual voters are deciding how they cast a ballot. Individual service providers are deciding whom they serve. Presidents are deciding who they will benefit once they're in office. So individuals are members of multiple communities, right? I've mentioned this several times already, right? And that we are both, we're members of departments and workplaces, but we're also members of sort of nations and states, and we're members of different ethnic groups or other sets of communities. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about how we can think about those communities in more detail. And then again, the really important thing is to sort of say, okay, there's multiple communities in the state, and we're going to set them on an equal theoretical footing, and even be open to the fact that when we're thinking about voting, it may not be anything about being a citizen and policies that matter. It may be sort of that really sort of the challenge for the voter is to adjudicate between whether they're going to do what their sort of religious community wants them to do and what their neighbors want them to do, right? That kind of thing. So let's start with some building blocks. The first is sort of arenas of authority. So what do I mean by that when I say that? And I want us to sort of basically distinguish between authorities and leaders. So I will often use authority as meant to sort of be the sort of the power within a community and how that's affecting individuals and what they do, not simply to be a single leader, right? So that's the first thing that's really important to distinguish. And I think of this like a football stadium, whether it's American or non. And basically, you have the sort of clear boundaries, right? We know whether we're inside or outside of it. It doesn't mean others necessarily know, right? But you as an individual knows whether they're inside or outside of an arena, right? There may be differences in terms of the porousness of those boundaries, which I think opens a set of theoretical questions that are quite interesting. There may be differences in how voluntary it is, right? And you can think of this even with regards to some of what we'll think of as the same types. Often think about, religious institutions as being the same type, right? But, in some cases, a person can easily kind of enter and exit different religious communities, and it's not entirely costly. In other countries or cases, societies, it becomes very costly, and you don't really have a choice. You're born a Shia, you're going to stay a Shia. You don't have a choice in terms of moving across these boundaries. So we can think about sort of the voluntariness, how voluntary it is to be a member. And the third thing I want us to sort of recognize is that we have shared goals. And I think this is the one that sometimes is maybe the most people sort of might have the most immediate objection to, which is because you can say, okay, wait a second, I know that if I'm thinking of my department as a community, we don't all seem to want the same things, right? We have different ideas about which subfield should get things, we have different ideas about who should be powerful or not, or how things should run. But ultimately what the shared goal is that you want the community to reproduce itself. You want it to survive into the future. So to that extent, we have shared goals over sustaining basically the community over time. Okay, so that's arenas of authority. And again, a single individual is a member of multiple arenas of authority. I want to give you a sort of a concrete example, also because I think this helps us to understand how in some cases arenas of authority will look very state-like. And in fact, I would argue the state, if we were, I wasn't able to sort of convince people to let me say it this way in the book, so it's in a footnote, but I think of the state as just one more arena of authority, right? So we get sometimes that they have, kind of a clear notion of what territory is, sort of, sets of institutions within them, legitimacy, et cetera. So this is a picture in Ghana, is of a paramount chief, and I was lucky to be there right before COVID with Karen Faris, so we were visiting this paramount chief, who on this day, so in Ghana, the chieftaincies have a very clearly defined territory, right? They have very sort of clear sense of legitimacy and sovereignty, even so much that the Ghanaian president will go to visit a paramount chief and pay homage to them as they start out their presidency and at various points in time. And they have very clear sets of social institutions within them, sort of like notions of who can ascend to leadership, et cetera. And in this particular day, what they were doing was, he had a PhD in statistics from the US, and he was going out to do, he was training enumerators who were going to go out and effectively do a census, right, to decide what kinds of needs they had in the kingdom and what they were going to do. So you get cases like this where sort of these arenas are very, very state-like, and they will sort of map on in ways that we're quite used to. And we get other times where there's a interesting and I think important distinctions to think through. For example, if we're thinking about the Catholic Church, a lot of the things we've talked about in terms of legitimacy, hierarchy, et cetera, all sort of pertain, right, or clear institutions pertain. But you don't necessarily have a sort of a territorial basis. I mean, outside of the Vatican, right? But sort of basically you have members very much sort of sprinkled among others. So that's the first building block. The second one is much easier in the sense that we've talked about social institutions, so there's no new terminology, to be introduced, but I want to be really clear and clearly sort of define what is meant by social institutions. In this case, it's a very Ostromian definition. In fact, I sort of point to the clear, like, it's essentially is Wallström's definition. We have rules, and rewards. It is not to suggest that these are mutually exclusive, right? We can have rules that, determine who can have what roles. But I think it's useful to keep in mind these three parts because it helps us to think later about what parts of social institutions might we be looking at in order to understand variations, right? Roles, of course, are those sort of the different positions that can be associated with rights and responsibilities. Rules that can determine who is able to take these roles. One of the things I want to flag, and we can come back to, is that while the arenas of authority often map onto what we can think of as identities, right? It's not always the case that every identity is an arena of authority, or that every arena necessarily maps onto how we would think of identity. So the clearest example is gender. Where I would argue that most cases what gender is doing is marking how rules sort of can translate into roles, right? Whether or not somebody can take a position or not take a position, more than we think about women or men having necessarily sort of an arena of authority. And then rewards are basically sort of the outcomes, right? The material, social, et cetera, benefits. It's a very rational choice type of definition. Again, it sort of very much maps onto Ostrom, but it gets us away from conflating social institutions and organizations, or social institutions and informality, and again, allows us then to say, okay, how do we understand when social institutions are formal or informal if we think of them in the terms of codification? So it's messy, right? I mean, I basically described a world that we can feel sort of maps onto how we think about things. Of course, we all know that we're members of lots of communities, and that these various sort of forces come at different times to suggest that we should do one thing or another. So what we don't want to do is just, we're trying to move away from just saying the world is messy and context matters, right? So the very first question then is, which arenas matter and when and why? How should we think through that? And so I'm going to give you several places or directions that I think are useful starting points coming out of some of the work that I and others have done. And I think that there's a lot more work to be done in this regard. So the first is coming from a piece with Kate Baldwin and Kristen Gao and myself. It should be coming out in AJPS hopefully any moment, now that we finally got our replication files all squared away. And basically it comes from a survey experiment that we did in Malawi, Kenya, and Zambia, where we basically have thought about, now we're thinking about leaders, right? But we think that the leaders are sort of in some ways representing the ways that we can think of also about domains of authority. And we have leaders who are either have the kind of their domain being supralocal or local, and then we have those who have either state expertise or customary expertise, okay? And so we're using three leaders. There are the MPs, which we think of as supralocal with state expertise, the local councillor, who has a local domain with state expertise, and the head person or village elder, who has local sort of scope, and then also customary expertise. And the three activities that we're just asking, obviously sort of reported willingness to participate in, are voting for a president, contributing to a school fund, or contributing to a burial fund. And the idea was that we expect that where people have sort of, where these match more closely, right, that where the leader has, basically state and supralocal expertise and domain, and the activity is at that level, we call it high congruence, where they have, for example, it's a state expertise, but it's local. Is if the MP was asking for contributing to schools, we would call it some congruence, and where it doesn't map on at all, we call it no congruence. And then we look to see whether or not congruence itself, in addition to the type of leader and all these other sort of factors, affects stated willingness to comply, and we find that it does. So over here you'll see that either with those with some congruence or high congruence, basically are more likely to say that they would comply if there was congruence between the activity and expertise and domain, and the leader with regards to expertise and domain than others. So first point is, we should think about the idea that there's a difference in terms of just what is presumed to be the domain or the sets of interests and sort of expertise for this. And by the way, the mechanism that seems to matter most, which is really interesting, is what we call domain congruence, or domain legitimacy, which is this idea that we think about legitimacy of leaders, right? but really that leaders' legitimacy to ask over different activities varies. So that's what seems to really drive things. But there's other things. Even if the sort of the arena matters equally, we can think of times when the arena is much stronger in some cases than it is in others. And this is to sort of draw our attention to factors that might affect that. One coming out of just work on collective action and others is sort of ideas of levels of solidarity, where the people see themselves as being part of the community, then they're much more likely to comply with what is being demanded of them, right? And the second is thinking about what we call encompassingness. And so this is the idea that, you know, in some cases, the same arena of authority actually has, you know, affects many aspects of an individual's life, and in other cases it doesn't. So again, to draw on the example of religious communities or religious arenas, you know, you can imagine one case in which, you know, basically everybody's, you know, as an individual, your friend set is in the congregation. This is you know, you send your child to a school that is associated with a congregation. When you had, you know, a hard time last time, you went to them, they helped you out, right? So many of your aspects of your life are being affected by, you know, the religious congregation and the arena of authority that's associated with it. You can imagine another case where, you know, your friends are entirely outside of that. They don't even understand why you go to church, yet alone why you're, you know, sort of, is that what they think is important? You know, you didn't rely on them and you don't have your kids in school. So these very different, you know, again, it's not about type and religious, ethnic, et cetera that matters. It's really the question of how encompassing is it for an individual. And the third can be thinking about information flows, right? And so this is pretty obvious, but sort of the more that people know each other and know what they're doing, right, then obviously sort of the more then they're able to essentially kind of, you know, if it's about sanctioning, you know whether they've complied or not, even if it's about, you know, sort of other sort of coordination issues, the more that they can know what is being asked of them. So using that same experiment that we talked about a moment ago, this is a piece with Priska Joost, who was a former PhD and is now at Constance. And basically we find both that proximity matters, right? And these are local leaders who are in your neighborhood, what we often think of as embedded leaders, right? That they're more likely to get compliance than sort of your MPs and those who are more distant. But also that their added advantage or added ability to get compliance as leaders is even stronger in places where everybody knows each other. So that's, yeah.
Sorry if I probably missed this, but what is compliance? How are you measuring compliance?
So we're saying to them essentially, you know, your MP has asked you to contribute to a school fund, you know, and it had a few other things, you know, people will know what you want, you know, whether you've done it or not, et cetera, and then how willing are you to contribute.
So it's me saying how willing I am. It's not a
so it's reported with willingness, yeah, which is, you know, in an ideal world it wouldn't be the case, but that's what we have. Yeah, and please feel free to stop me at any time. So those are about the kind of the nature of the arenas of authority, right? But then we can also think about individual characteristics that might affect whether or not an individual within these arenas is sort of more or less likely to need to comply or to be willing to comply. Some of this is just idiosyncratic, right? So, you know, you just get people, there's a kind of nice quote in the book, you get some people who just are going to do what they want to do, and it doesn't seem to have anything to do with any other characteristics except for they're going to do what they want to do. But then I think there's a lot of other things that are actually more systematic, and that we can start to think about when would different arenas matter more, but also which types of people would they matter more over, right? So, you know, from some of the work that I'd done in Jordan in the 2000s, you know, basically it showed that those in rural areas were much more likely to comply with and to vote on tribal bases, where those in urban areas were less likely to vote overall, about half as likely to vote as somebody in the rural area. And when they voted, they were often more likely to vote with regards to Islamists, right? But at the individual level, you also see that people who are wealthier, who, you know, essentially it's often the poor who are voting, right? Because not just because of kind of vote buying issues, which we'll come back to in a minute, but also just because they're more reliant on, you know, kind of the goodwill of what's going to happen in the future. The future costs or benefits, and that stream is different. So that's thinking about the arenas. And we still have to say, okay, that's all great, but then how do I know what's going to happen? How do I know how a person's going to vote? Or take something like COVID, which I think is easy to think about. You know, you can imagine one case in which if the arena that matters, again, go back to religion, if the arena that matters is religion, you had some churches that basically said, look, you know, God will take care of us, right? Therefore, we leave our doors open, and you don't need to get vaccinated, right? And there were other churches that also said, God will take care of us, therefore we know that we should close our doors, and please go get vaccinated, right? So you have exactly the two, like they look very similar, right? The arena matters to people, you know, it's even, you know, again, nominally the same type of arena, and you have very different, you know, expectations and obligations. So on the one hand, what this is a call for us, if we want to do work, to actually do very grounded work, right? To sort of really understand, you know, what meaning do people give to something like voting? Is this about showing allegiance to your tribe as well as about, you know, selecting a candidate for policy reasons, right? So, you know, the kind of Lisa Wadeen talks about multiple meanings, and I think that's part of what we're drawing attention to. But then also, what is expected in these cases, right? So it does require kind of a grounded thinking, and then from a framework perspective, you know, it still leaves you saying, okay, well, since we can't know every, you know, sort of the sort of details of every rule, what do we do? And I want to sort of propose that we look at certain types of rules, right? And we start to sort of categorize them and be able to think about, okay, what type of rule will be affecting this kind of outcome? This is not intended, again, to be exclusive. It's intended to sort of spark ideas and to allow sort of, you know, kind of further development of this. But the three that I look at are basically leadership selection rules, engagement rules, and group boundaries. So with regards to leadership selection, most of the literature that we have that's coming out, or at least that I've been able to read and look at, that's coming out with regards to understanding how traditional authorities and the competition over leadership within them affects responsiveness, suggests exactly the same thing that we think comes out of most of the studies of the state, right? Which is that where you have more competition over leadership, you get more responsiveness. So that's the first thing. We see that in Sierra Leone with Asamoah, Reed, and Robinson. Alagao shows it to us with regards to Jordan, et cetera. The second, which I think is interesting and important, and Sue, since you're here, I'm going to be sort of very interested in your take on this, is to think more about individualist versus collectivist rules, right? So, I mean, I think a lot of times, and particularly when in the literature on clientelism, as it turned towards thinking about vote buying, it often thought of things, at least talked about things very dyadically, right? So, you know, the broker and the voter, for example. And that makes sense in some cases, but in other cases you actually see that essentially it's a much broader community that is essentially kind of engaged and determines, if we want to think of it in this way, you know, kind of the payoffs. Not only because more people are affected, right, but because then, you know, part of the sort of the, you know, the cost or of compliance or non-compliance to you is actually coming through others who are sort of then affected, right? How much do these communities then sort of give you feedback? And an interesting example of this comes from Mazzucato and Kupke, who don't put it in these terms, but basically what they're showing is that the reason why you got Ghanaians in the Netherlands who are giving back money to the burial funds in their communities is because of the fact that their family members who are in the community will suffer if they don't do so, right? And their family members are also then putting pressure on them in essentially sort of imposing costs on them if they're not doing so, right? So I think that we can do more to think about, you know, what types of essentially kind of rules are we looking at? Are they individualist or collectivist? I also think that we can do more on looking at group boundaries, and this is probably my favorite set of rules. I think partly because it was sort of newest to me in a sense, right? But group boundaries and group boundary maintenance is this idea that groups want to sort of demonstrate or portray themselves to be unified and together, right? So it can be from things as simple as, you know, how they're dressing, right? You know, the monk wears orange robes, the, you know, Hasidic Jews wears tassels and a hat. I mean, so this idea that there's something that sort of portrays we exist and we are this, to other things about how you can act, right? At times they can also, I don't talk about this much in the book, but I'm thinking about it more and more, they can also be constraining, right? So I was at a meditation retreat and a monk said, you know, he was describing when he was really frustrated and angry when he was driving, and and he says, but when you're dressed like a monk, you can't show road rage, right? So this idea that there are some things you can do and some things you can't do, and it helps to kind of police your own behavior in terms of how you're dressed. And I saw an example of this. So after the Libyan elections for the GNC in 2012, I was working with NDI and essentially doing some party trainings and some parliamentary trainings. And so I was talking to somebody who'd been elected, and he was from a minor tribe in sort of the south, and he had told me that how they ended up sort of succeeding was that there were three minor tribes, and it was approximately like one had 5,000 members, another had 3,000, one had 2,000. The major tribe had 7,000 or 8,000. And the idea was that as long as they sort of joined a common list and supported each other, they thought they could win. So the first thing that was interesting was that he said that they met and discussed this at weddings, because at weddings, the major tribe never came to their weddings, so they figured they could do this then without being detected, right? But then I said to him, okay, that's great, but do people always really vote for you? I mean, like, what happens if they don't? And he basically said, without these terms, the probability of them not voting for us and the others about the same, so that's okay. Mm-hmm. And then he added, but what they can't do is stand up publicly and say they won't vote for us, right? So not sort of to portray that we're not unified. And of course, you can say, well, as long as they can vote, it's the same thing, but it's not really, right? Because how much do I expect that they're all going to vote together, and what do I think that means for the success of others? Can obviously be shaping how you vote. So that's one example of sort of group boundary maintenance and the kinds of things and ways that we could look at how it would impact things. I also want to make the case, or get us to think about how we might understand then new institutions. And in this case, I want us to think about electoral institutions, which we would often think of as being state institutions, right? So, and I think the tendency is to think, okay, this is a state institution, so what are the sort of the demands that drive how it gets shaped? So essentially what happened in Libya, again, this is before the GNC elections, you had a lot of international electoral engineers coming in, and they had two problems that they were trying to solve. They were trying to solve the problem that political parties were very, very weak. So they wanted to, essentially their ideal would have been to have party lists, but they at least wanted to have lists to help to try to strengthen coordination and ultimately to foster political parties. And they also wanted to deal with sort of the gender issues, which was a big thing around this time, sort of more globally, and they wanted to see gender quotas. So they devised a two-tiered system, which in their mind is supposed to look like Germany, right? So you've got this 120 individual seats that are going to be elected, and overlaying them is supposed to be a set of essentially kind of PR list seats, right? And in the same districts. And then they put this and they announced it, and they were going to have a horizontal and a vertical zipper list. So every other seat on a list is going to be male or female, and then if you have more than one list, you have to do, start one with a male and one with a female. And in that, they were sort of one-upping the Tunisians who had done the vertical list but not the horizontal list. So they're very happy with this. It is a compromise, of course, among a lot of the political elites. And then they announce it, and all of a sudden, really in some ways, all hell breaks loose. They get, at that time, still fax machines are going, they get telephone calls, they get delegations coming into the offices and saying, this won't work. And there were two reasons why they said it wouldn't work. They said it wouldn't work because, you're telling me that community over there could end up having our representative, right? So in places particularly where there's, where localism was very, very strong, and one community had a long-standing conflicts with others, and this actually happens a lot in the mountainous areas, they were just not okay with that. And they were also saying, you want us to try to find, two women who will be on this list of 4. We can't find 2 to run. How would we find one of them who would go down to Tripoli and actually represent us if they won? So there's a lot then of deals that get cut, to the point where at the end of the day, you have somebody that's like Marianne, which is in the mountainous region, and they got only independent seats, right? And then the PR seats get pushed to places like Benghazi and Tripoli, where they're sort of more accepting of them. It becomes, this is, from an electoral administration point of view, an absolute mess, right? So you have the electoral engineers saying, these people don't understand, right? but the interesting thing was, that first that in the sort of the conceiving of the law, these other sets of arenas and institutions that clearly mattered quite strongly weren't taken into account. And the others, that if you think of the sort of even the seat distribution as being part of kind of the institution that gets devised, that this is both representing and in some ways it's as much a social institution as a state one. So that gives you a sense of some of the things I think are for the implications of the study of politics and development. But just to kind of wrap up a little bit, I think it suggests that we should alter the process of how do we do our inquiries by starting first. Okay, I know I'm interested in voting, or I know I'm interested in service provision, et cetera. But what does this actually really mean in these contexts? Which arenas actually are engaged in this, see this as something about whether the family is united or whether or not the sort of the congregation is demonstrating piety, et cetera. And then what is expected of individuals, how will they act, and how does it aggregate? So that's the first part. I think it also asks us to develop new tools. So some of this can, and I think much of this should be done with kind of deep ethnographic work, but also that we can think about devising some instruments that we can use to try to figure out where does governance take place. So I'd like to think of the LGPI, which is about a decade in the making, as, if I could ever get states to understand it, I think that they need to know how people are governed as much as they need to know how many bathrooms and bedrooms people have, right? So ultimately, it's like a census of governance processes and how transparent exactly. It's like the same things we often see like when WBI indicators for the state, but also for various other arenas. I also think it asks to sort of think about some new theoretical questions, and some of them I've mentioned, but also, for example, what is the role of formality if we think of formality as parchment, right, of parchment institutions? So I have a paper with Melanie Phillips and Karen Faree and Lauren Honig in the APSR, where what we argue is that the people wanted to have a property that would have land documents or a sort of a written document to show it that they had title. They didn't care as much if it was from a customary or state authority. So we're able to separate out who gives these titles and the existence of or non-existence of a title. And the existence and non-existence of a title is important independently of who's given it. And interestingly, the evidence seems to suggest that's because it becomes legible to those around you, right? So it's not even just about the enforcement authority of others. We can think about things like bridge actors, people who are, for example, maybe leaders, both in the, say, a leader of an ethnic group, but also becomes an MP, or, what does it mean when those positions are held by people who are influential in more than one arena, which can help us to think about the dynamics of arenas in terms of how they may be changing over time. Something like gender quota laws, right, are ultimately aimed not only at changing representation within parliaments, for example, but also in terms of changing how people think about what men and women should and can do. And finally, the sort of big question about how we think about how things aggregate too. So I want to be really fast because I want to hear more from you guys. But basically, the kinds of projects that we're working on with regards to this are over community resilience. How do communities respond to shocks? Using COVID as the example, but I'm thinking of it in terms of what might this tell us about especially environmental shocks that are coming or here. Things about emerging cities, so how does governance change when you have fast-growing cities? And then migration, looking at domestic migration and making the argument that domestic migration has variation both in terms of how much a person can enter a community, right? So we always think of it as just being everybody can go everywhere, but we know even if we're looking in the US that we have, gated communities or over 50s, we have places where not everybody can go. And then we have differences in terms of basically sort of how much your identity for various reasons would make it easier or harder to cooperate. So we're doing that. And then we're working on a bunch of sort of tools and theoretical advances. So I'm working on refining the LGPI, and if that's of interest to anybody, please let me know. We're actually looking for some people to work with us as consultants on validation. We have a project trying to understand better competing authorities or arenas of authority, and local governance is a complex system. So if you're not asleep by now, we can chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Can you talk more about the competing authorities that you're talking about? You discussed about whether there's an overlap of domain the case of the tribe and how the Ghanaian president visits the tribe. So one is legitimizing the other in a way.
Mhm.
But when that is not the case, when there is, say, militancy or anti-democratic elements, when there's a state element or non-state element, and when they don't get along with each other, how does that impact on the behavior of the competing authorities?
You want to join this project, I think. So, no, because that's exactly, the Competing Authorities Project is exactly taking that, right? So the element book is quite static. Okay, well, let's assume that, you know, these authorities matter at this, and I think that's fair. I mean, it's a useful starting point, right? But we do know that authorities attempt to sort of extend their strength. And so I was talking to somebody actually from Ukraine, who was talking about how the Russian Ukrainian church or Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, right, essentially, you know, at times, you know, really basically try to usurp others' congregations, right? And so that's a good example of competition that ends up, at least in some cases, in, you know, fully sort of one side or the other effectively kind of capitulating, if you will, right? And you can have other times, like, for example, in Lebanon, where, you know, ultimately, if we think about sort of the sects and the state as having competed over, you know, how do you sort of govern individuals' lives, right? What we ended up with was a compromise where, you know, civil authority and civil rights and actions are governed by the sectarian, you know, courts and laws, and then the sort of the state governs others. So the point of this project is to ask exactly the questions that you're asking, right? Is when do we get these different outcomes, and when and what are the strategies that are being used, et cetera. So, and in terms of like this project itself, I have, you know, basically 10 people from across the MENA. We're looking at everything from, you know, how does the sort of the state and congregations in Morocco, you know, deal with, you know, what should be sort of the messages from the pulpit, to thinking about, you know, business, family, and sect in Lebanon over voting, and with exactly the questions that you've asked in mind.
So in the graph that you presented about the self-compliance, so is it majorly about the willingness of the people to contribute,
Yeah.
depending on the leader that is asking for such a thing? Like,
This is the right one?
yeah.
Yeah. So basically, it's in a sense kind of in addition to the leader, right? So what we find, for example, these are the leaders themselves, okay? We find the local councillors and the MPs always don't have very much power, okay? The people, you know, for various reasons don't necessarily think that they should be asking them to do almost anything. But at least they have more power when it comes to asking them to do things that are congruent, right? So that the congruence is essentially, you can think of it as sort of the additional, you know, strength that a leader is getting, because it's there's congruence between the activity of the leader, independent of the other factors. The other thing you'll note, and this is, I think, important because you haven't asked it, but I'll tell you anyway, is that, you know, you'll see that voting and school funds are always, the baseline here is the burial fund, right? And the burial fund is a hard one because, and ultimately was probably not the smartest choice as an activity, because in some ways it's like, you know, taking it almost has a sort of a habit to sort of form to it, you know, kind of in that sense that, you know, people contribute to a burial funds, you know, almost without thinking, the same way you take a gift to a birthday party, almost without thinking, right? So at that point, you know, just the compliance on that is really, really, really high. But it allows me to sort of make that distinction. I mean, I think that, you know, what I'm looking at here are activities for which, you know, it wouldn't be that you just do it, right? That's,
The some-congruence and high congruence, is the baseline there
no congruence.
no congruence? So just say a little more about how you set that up, like how does that treatment kind of work? What are you telling people?
Yeah. So we're saying to people, we don't say anything about congruence. So
Right.
congruence is pre-registered, right? And it is to say, you know, customary local, you know, is like the head person in burial fund is high congruence,
Right.
right? So that's, but then what we say to people, and I should have had the whole prompt here for you, but basically it is, you know, your MP is asking you to contribute to a school fund, you know. basically, or your key things is very important, is asking you to contribute to a school fund. It said either other people, the leader would know whether or not you did it, but nobody else would know. The leader and other people would know, or no one would know. And the idea with no one would know was that we thought that that would get us to some understanding, kind of just legitimacy, right? I would have no sanctioning about it. And then we said about 50% of the people did a similar activity in your community last time, 90% did or 10% did. The idea there was to be able to look at how much this is about coordination, right? So where if what the leader does is help with coordination, then at the 50%, they should have mattered more. And then the knowing was to get you also to the sanctioning. The first part, the leader will know, is to get you to sort of thinking about sanctioning.
So what's an example of a no congruence situation?
No congruence is your MP asking you to do the burial fund,
Got it.
or your head person asking you to vote. Yeah. And then the sums are, those. Yeah.
So, if I remember correctly, you mentioned that the MPs and the local councillors don't have a ton of sway regarding local issues. And a lot of the discussion so far has surrounded sort of emerging democracies, or at least democracies where you mentioned election engineers are coming in and trying to figure out some optimized method for participation and sort of representation in these new democracies. But since sort of the whole idea that we're trying to theorize here or get to is that these systems are dynamic, I was wondering if an example sort of presented here, if you ran this experiment in countries that maybe have had democracy around for longer, at least more established, if those results might look a bit different. It's hard to sort of speculate about this sort of thing, but.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and I think that if put it slightly differently, if I asked exactly these same sets of actors, I expect that they might look differently, because our hypothesis about whether or not things are congruent or non-congruent might be slightly different, right? So essentially, I don't think necessarily that just because it is in an established, OECD democracy, that we would expect that there's nothing else that matters except for your local counselor, right? But we would expect the kind of, these factors might be different, right? The sort of the baseline of, just how much influence does a different leader have, which should be different. And if we can theorize about what's congruent or non-congruent, I would expect the congruence still to matter, right? And that gets to this point about sort of needing to know enough about what place you're in to be able to make those distinctions. Is it entirely opaque?
I just wanted to know that when we're handling the election procedures, very much at many times we see that the kind of political majority that we wanted to see in the whole process of democracy or democratic elections does not take place. It's end up in a deadlock with just generation of communal majority. Only tribes and tribes thinking about in their tribes understanding and then exercising those tribal understandings on a democratic front. So there is no political majority with the new political ethical dynamics, with new political moral dynamics. So in that case, my first question is how an MP or a member of parliament can actually influence the local dynamics, local culture, social dynamics, where people will start thinking about the new ethical moral nuances, first thing. And second thing, if the whole social, political business and a cultural everyday business of an individual person rests on a social cultural fragment, then how influential the political situations become. Because at the end of the day, if my religion tells me not to vote this person or not to listen to a woman, then how am I supposed to vote that woman?
Yeah. So, great questions. In some ways, I mean, I think when you think about the strengths of different arenas, right? So that you can almost, if you will, reverse engineer or think about where does that give you leverage if what you wanted to do was say, okay, we want the sort of the state and political, sort of drivers to matter more on these local levels. We don't want it just to be tribal politics taking it into Parliament, which you're totally right is often the case. And one of the things that this allows us to sort of think about is under what conditions and when is it that the tribal politics is just basically translating into Parliament, and what should. But then we can say, okay, well, if we think that arenas are particularly strong because, because there's ideas of domain congruence, right? Then can we shape in sort of through kind of civic education notions about what is appropriate or not appropriate, or even through laws. So, one of the debates that Kate and I had as we went into this one was that I come from thinking about things much more from the Middle East, where there's nothing that says a tribal leader in Jordan shouldn't be influencing votes. Everybody knows they do, and actually if you go into an election tent in Jordan, then what you see are banners that say this tribe supports X candidate and this tribe supports it. So the whole tribal endorsement is basically bread and butter for how politics work there. In some of the cases here, so in Malawi and I think also in Zambia, it is illegal for a tribe, basically kind of a tribal leader or a village head to actually endorse and now it doesn't mean they don't do it. It doesn't mean that there's no influence. Actually, everybody knows that there is. But just in terms of sort of having sort of put in people's minds, this is an inappropriate thing for this leader to do, or this is it's not appropriate for us to think about this in terms of ethnicity and ethnic arenas, for instance, then there is a way in which institutions can help to do that, and education can help to do that. We can also think then about places where things start to break down, right? Where people become more independent of their sort of leaders for social welfare, those kinds of things, right? So different ways of trying to take the strength of arenas and say, what would be the ways in which, if what one wanted to do was to weaken one and strengthen another, what are the ways in which you could do that? Can I give you one more food for thought? And this, I think, is useful for, again, distinguishing between the, some people sort of get caught up on the sort of, okay, where is culture in this, right? And where are norms, right? And Simeon and Elkin have this thing where they talk about 3 different ways of understanding culture. And if you think about culture in terms of institutions, then I'm right there with them. If you think of it in terms of preferences, I think we need to know what preferences are, but this isn't about preferences, right? And if we think about it just as habit, right, then I think that it helps us to actually distinguish between cases. So, take 2 ways in which we've had policies that try to influence, change, right? One, which is about littering, right? So people, especially none of you are old enough, maybe we're on the same, can remember that in the 70s it was not unusual for a person to have, eaten an ice cream cone and like thrown a wrapper off. Just people threw stuff out of the window as a matter of it just seemed like slightly less inconvenient than keeping it in the car, but it wasn't, there was no notion that if you actually weighed it and threw it away appropriately that there was something aib about that or a problem. It was just what people did, right? And so arguably, I'm sure that they thought it was hard, but littering laws come into place. They start stopping people and fining them heavily for littering, and then suddenly you get to a point where if I was to throw something out of the car and my kids were in it, I'm sure they'd be like, "What the heck, Mom?" Even you can't get away with falsely not fully recycling on a day. So that would never happen. So that's a kind of an easy case, right? Because really there was not an arena of authority that said you should be throwing your litter from the car, right? Now you take something like FGM, right? And of course, female genital mutilation, which, in some communities it defines who's going to be good and marriageable, right? And so you go in and you try to do the same thing. You try to sort of very heavily influence that people should stop FGM practice. But you run up against the fact that there are people who think, this makes my daughter marriageable or not. So I think we can use this framework to decide what are going to be more difficult, kind of levers and or kind of practices to change if that's desirable, and also where do you need to change them. And I'm not saying that nobody's doing this. There are people Bicchieri's doing this, and there are people at the World Bank doing this, etc. But it does help us to think about what are the cases where we really need to do this before you decide you really need to do it because you just failed before, right? Like that's sort of a one way to think about what I hope is useful about this.
I could help thinking about Michael Walzer's Spheres of Justice, which is like really he's saying something very similar about the sources of legitimacy. The basic idea is that there are different kind of spheres of not authority but of kind of human activity, and you know they can be religious or they can be finance or it could be family or and there are different kind of legitimate currencies in each, and that can change over time and it can be cultural as you're saying, but there can be from our perspective the legitimate currency of spirituality and religious authority might be or religious authority might be spirituality and religious training, and it shouldn't be money. And we have a word which I can't remember what the word is for the buying of office, the purchase of office, which became sort of verboten in probably with the Reformation or something, or political, in politics, sort of leadership qualities or knowledge about public policy are legitimate currencies, whereas connections are not, or money again is not, and he connects it. I mean, I think in your terms it would be the sources of legitimacy of the authority, and when it's a nice very simple model of when it's there and when it's not there. I mean, it's a very different kind of project because it's really a theory of justice, but it kind of was what you were saying really struck me as interesting and connected to.
Interesting. Now I need to look at that. Spheres of Justice?
Spheres of Justice.
Okay.
It came out in like early 80s or something, but it's a really great book.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I'm trying to push against, so this would actually be really useful for me because there may be limits to my pushing against it, but is this idea that we should think of ethnicity, or we should think of like this whole sort of almost like siloing of ethnicity and politics or religion and politics, like those ways of thinking, and trying to say, okay, well, there are times when religious spheres may be more different than kind of ethnic, like that they're not the same thing, and that we look for qualities as opposed. But this question of whether or not there's sort of different bases of legitimacy would be useful. Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time. Does anybody have one last question that they want to ask Professor Walls?
Burning question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question there. Understanding the legitimacy of formal institutions and non-formal institutions like the head priests or the community leaders. When you compare and contrast this formal and informal sources of power, according to you, or according to your observation, which came to be more prominent, the legal sources of power or the sources of power in terms of traditions and customs?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I would, as you probably know by now, I would push back a little on the formal and informal, equating it with state and other arenas. And I think that this is the interesting thing, right? It's not about that in one place sort of generally it's more or less, right? I think it varies by place, in different arenas that are important in different places, and then it varies by individuals to some extent, right? So you can even get individuals within the same context that see it very differently. So I don't know that we can say that we can have as broad a statement of this is either more legitimate or stronger, et cetera, that it really is, that's what this aims to try to get us to ask as a starting point to understand what takes place.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's great.
Appreciate it.
Can I ask two things of everybody? Can you, we're circulating a couple of pieces of paper just to put down your name and contact information. And please eat. If you've already eat some more because there's a lot of food. If you have a hungry roommate,
Eat.
Yes, this is the mom and me.
Yeah.